All right, hello class. Today we're going to start talking about social psychology. I think in the previous video I said that we'd be talking about developmental psychology. Unfortunately, that is one of the sections that we're skipping this semester due to the strange circumstances, the doubly strange circumstances now. But we will be today starting on social psychology. So, what is social psychology? What are we talking about when we say that we're studying or that we're interested in social psychology? Well, social psychology is the study of how the situation affects the individual. Now, psychology, of course, is just the study of the individual's mind or their behaviors and their mind, but when we talk about social psychology, we're looking specifically at how the situation, how the environment, how the people around the individual can affect that individual's psychology. So this is what we're going to look at, and we're going to start by taking a look at 3 rules. These are Lieberman's rules of social psychology. He actually has 5 of them. We're actually just going to look at the first 3. I think those are the most critical to understanding that. So the first is that situations are powerful. What does this mean? Well, one aspect of the individual psychology, and I think this is particularly true in Western cultures, in the United States in particular, we really like to think of ourselves as individuals. We really like to think of ourselves as that everything that we decide to do is something that we chose to do, that nobody else influenced us, and if we did, we're doing them a favor, right? This type of exchange, that we really are the arbiters of our own destiny. But what social psychology tells us, and one of the things that we're going to focus on, is this idea that really that's a lie that we tell ourselves. In fact, a lot of the things that we tend to do have to do with the people around us, have to do with the situation that we're in. One of the things I tend to say at this point, if we were sitting in class together, is you're all acting similarly, right? You're all sitting down, you're all maybe writing or typing, you're all looking at me, you're all relatively quiet. Is this how, are you all the same person? Is this how you always act? If I saw you at a party, would you be this type of person? And of course not. Of course, the reason that you might be all acting in this fashion, or in similar ways at least, is because the situation that you're in dictates that behavior, right? Dictates that you would sit down, pay attention, and take some type of notes, or at least record, what you're learning in some type of way. So, again, this first piece is that situations are powerful. They influence us in ways that we aren't necessarily aware of. Sorry, I have some notes here that I'm looking at. Situations, one of the reasons situations can be so powerful is that they are invisible. They're often invisible. That is to say, we aren't usually aware of the situation that we're currently in. And so if you're sitting at home right now, or I don't know, you're certainly not at a coffee shop, but wherever you are, right, you have some sense of the environment you're in, and that's a part of the situation. But maybe something else is going on, right? Maybe you're in a bad mood, or maybe you're hungry, or maybe you just woke up, or maybe there's some noise, or your parents or your siblings or your partners or your children are talking in the background, right? All of these things are a part of the situation, and social psychology would tell us that whether we realize it or not, right, these invisible things, that is to say, they're not, it isn't that you can't see your kid, asking for your attention, but you don't necessarily regard that as a situation, and you don't necessarily understand or regard how that situation is influencing you. It is influencing your psychology. So, situations are powerful. One of the reasons for this is that we underestimate them. Another reason for this is that they are invisible. Another important aspect of this feature of situations being powerful is that it's going to vary from person to person. That is to say, even 2 people in the same environment may be in different situations. What does that mean? So again, if we were in class, I would maybe call on one student and I'd say, well, what does this mean? That one person or the two people in the same environment can be in separate situations. And after a little bit of going on, I would point out that, hey, you're in a different situation than everybody around you because, hey, I'm talking to you, right? And this has changed your dynamic, this has changed the situation for you. Now you're asked to do something other than sit down and be quiet and take notes, right? And you're thinking about, well, what are the students going to think of me? What is the professor going to think of me? Do I know the answer to his question, or do I have a question of my own, right? And so all of those things are going to change the situation that you're in. What you should note, of course, is that the situation does not just include the environment. The situation doesn't just include the space that you're in, it also includes perhaps the mindset that you're in, or your emotional situation, right? The history, what you just came from, right? Are you tired or from practice? Are you tired from sleeping not enough, right? All of these things are still a part of your situation. Again, they're invisible in such a way that we don't necessarily pay attention to their regard, or we don't necessarily pay attention to their effect on us, but they are still having a powerful effect. So situations are powerful. We underestimate them. They're invisible. They vary from person to person. And they actually influence our perception of others in certain ways. So there's a study that's done where they show an individual two sets of pictures, and the pictures are, always going to be the same for the two sets or the people that they're shown to, but we're going to vary what we tell you is going on in each picture, right? And so both are pictures of people who are sad, and in one of the pictures we'll just say, hey, this person is sad, they had a bad day. On a scale of 1 to 10, rate how sad this person looks, rate how sad they look, right? And then we'll show them another picture. Again, for every person, we'll swap these pictures. So what we're saying about the situation that each person is in doesn't necessarily, isn't true, right? These are just people, stock photos. So we tell the person, the subject, about the second picture. This person is also sad. They're sad because they're at a funeral. Right? And so one of those has more kind of weight about what we would think the person, or how sad we think the person should be, right? Had a bad day, sad, versus at a funeral, sad. And so what we ask people to do, again, is rate how sad this person at the funeral looks. And it turns out that no matter which person, which face we put with each situation, the person at the funeral is always a lot sadder. Now, this means that we're not actually saying that they look sadder, right? Because it's the same two pictures, but what we are saying is that we perceive them as being sadder because of the situation that we know that they're in. So not only are situations powerful in terms of how they affect our own behavior, but they're also powerful in terms of how we judge the behavior of others. Again, invisible, and also we will underestimate this effect. And then lastly, on this first point, situations are also going to affect us in the future. So the history of our situations, the history of our experiences broadly, are another type of situation, right? What we bring to the table. If you've had a professor who is about my age, who's male, who's a black guy, and you really didn't like him, well, you're going to bring that to the table in terms of whether or not you think you would enjoy being in a class or being in another class with me. On the other hand, if you had a professor like me who you really enjoyed, you might bring that to the table. Now, that doesn't necessarily always dictate, it's not about having an experience with a different type of person. That often is a big factor, but it's just the point that what's happened to you in the past, right? Those experiences also surround you with another type of situation that will affect how you think and how you behave. Okay, so point number 2. Read this one. We often don't know why people do the things they do. often don't know why people do the things they do. Well, what does this mean? This means that one of the ways that situations are powerful, and in some cases we can think about that difference between the funeral and the bad day and say, well, yeah, I can imagine that somebody having a bad day, or looking at these two pictures and how my perception of their sadness will be changed by thinking about them either having a bad day versus, versus being in a funeral. And so we can maybe appreciate that difference, but we still really do underestimate how much situations not only affect us, but how much they affect others. In fact, we do this so much that social psychologists have called the way that we handle understanding other people's behaviors or thinking about other people's behaviors, they've called this the fundamental attribution error. The fundamental attribution error. Now, fundamental just means the most basic, right? The foundation. So what they're saying up front is that this type of error is fundamental. We do this so often that we've called it the number one, the fundamental, the most basic error that we make in terms of judging other people's behaviors and thought processes. Attribution, of course, means to what do you attribute? To what do you name the cause? What's the cause of such a thing is the same thing as saying to what do you attribute it to, right? And so the fundamental error of cause, or the fundamental error of attribution, is about it's about thinking about why a person is doing a certain thing. And so it goes like this. When we see somebody doing a behavior, especially if this is a person that we don't know very well, such that we can't really get in their head, right? It's one thing if you see somebody yelling at their kid and you know that they're a really good parent and they're just having a bad day and this is the 10th time the kid hasn't listened on this one shopping trip, right? So that's one thing. But it's another thing if you see that same lady in the store and she's not your friend, right? Now you're gonna attribute her behavior to something else. And so the fundamental attribution error says, and you may have gotten the hint here, is that when we see a person doing something, especially a person we don't know, we tend to attribute their behavior almost entirely to their own self, their own psychology, their own individual practices, right? That is to say, we rarely, if ever, regard the situation that they're in. We rarely would see that lady in the supermarket yelling at her kid and say, oh man, I bet she's just had it today. She's just had a bad day. You might say that if maybe you yourself are in that same situation, but generally, right, most generally, if you can't, again, get inside the person's head, you're gonna say that lady is a bad person, or that lady is a bad mom, or that lady's a mean mom, right? You're gonna say it's about who she is. So I'm gonna link a little video in the description. It's a little dated. It's from Seinfeld. I think it's hilarious. People often don't laugh in class. Maybe they're just shy. But you'll see a Seinfeld link in the what do you call it? In the description, and it will be on the fundamental attribution error. So you'll see this, and this plays out not necessarily in a psychological way, but it plays out in a physical way, right? Thinking about this is who you are. This is the type of person that you are versus the situation that you were just in has caused you to be this way, right? What's interesting is that we tend to do the opposite when we think about our own behavior. Especially if that behavior is bad in some way. And so if we see ourselves doing another thing or notice ourselves doing something we don't like, we're very likely to externalize that and say, well, I've had a bad day, or you got me so angry, or I'm just hungry, I'm usually not this frustrated, right? And so we will give ourselves that break of thinking about how the situation affects our own psychology, but we often don't extend that same understanding to others. Again, we do it so much that social psychologists call this the fundamental attribution error. Okay, so rule number 3 is we often don't know what we don't know. often don't know what we don't know. What does that mean? Well, it means that when it comes to this type of bias, right? When it comes to the bias that's inherent in the fundamental attribution error, when it comes to the bias even in thinking about ourselves and saying, well, the reason that I did that is because of X, Y, and Z that's happening. I'm a good person, right? The reason, the understanding of this third point is that we're not even aware of the fact that we're making these biases. Now, maybe that's evident in the fact that we're talking about it this way and it needs to be pointed out, but if you remove this set of principles from this set of rules, well, it is important to say. That is, it is important to say that we don't notice the things that we don't notice. We aren't aware of our own biases. And so the way that the situations are affecting us, the way that we regard people based on the situation that they're in, is something, again, back to point one, that is almost totally, or that generally is totally invisible to us. It's something that we aren't noticing that we're doing. And again, back to point one, that in fact makes these situations much more powerful in terms of how they affect us and how they affect our individual psychology. Okay, so these are these three principles. Again, Lieberman's, if you're going to Google it or something, it's Lieberman's 5 principles of social psychology, but we've just gone over the first 3. I think these pretty much get it exactly what we need to talk about for this class. So next up, what I want to do is just describe some of the most important findings, some of the most important terms in social psychology. And usually this is one of my favorite classes to teach because I'm showing a lot of videos. Obviously, that's a little difficult here, but so I'm just going to go through the terms and then I'll link all of those videos down below, and I'll try to mention them here as I'm talking about these different terms. All right, so let's go over some terms from social psychology. The first is conformity. Conformity is our tendency to do what everyone else is doing. Again, this kind of goes against the grain of an American or a Western mindset, but this is a very powerful instinct in human beings. In fact, humans are actually pack animals. That is to say, much like zebra or deer or elk or something, we herd together, we group together because there's some safety in numbers. Now, not necessarily in the same safety that zebras find, right? Like being in a pack and blending together, it's difficult to pick one out, but that actually is a bit of a piece of it, not because lions are trying to eat us, but really because if you're alone, let's say that, and again, you got to think tribally here, let's say that you're alone, you don't have a tribe, well, you're going to be an easy target for anybody that wants to steal your stuff or pick you off or whatever it is, right? And so one of the ways that we've evolved to protect ourselves is to want to be in groups. Now, most of us want this. There are some psychological disorders which make it such that people don't want to really be in groups or would prefer to be left alone. But for the most part, we really do conform. Now, this goes beyond just wanting to be in groups. Conformity is really about changing one's behavior to match the group, or changing one's way of thinking to match the group. So what does this look like? Excuse me, there's a study that was done, and they took a group of students, and in the room, they sat them around a table, and everyone in the room, except for this one student, was a senior. This other student was a freshman. Next, everyone that was a senior was what we call a confederate. That is to say, they were actually in on the study. They weren't being studied themselves, they were part of setting the study up. So what they do is they have all of these folks come in, including one freshman, and they have a professor draw 3 lines on the board. And they go around the table, starting here and ending with the freshman, and they say, which of these three lines is longer? Line A, line B, or line C? And every one of the seniors says that line A is the longest line, even though clearly line B was the longest line. Now, what do you think happens when they get to the freshman? You're right. He said that line A was also the longest line. This is a great demonstration of conformity, right? This is something that's not a difficult test to pass. It's not a difficult thing to ask a person to do, and yet, even though his better judgment likely told him that line B was the longest line, because everybody else said that line A was the longest, and there's also some dynamics of power in terms of freshman and senior, and also he was last, right? But because of that social situation and because of conformity, he went ahead and went against his better judgment and said what everyone else said. Line A is the longest line. This is how conformity works. We sometimes just do things because everyone else is doing it. Now, sometimes it pushes up against us like this guy probably went home and was thinking, you know, what the hell, are they doing some special math? Like, why did everyone say that line A was the longest line? But at other times, it's just stuff that we just do it, right? It might be a tradition. It might be the type of clothes that we wear, right? Everybody's probably, even though you're not in class, wearing some type of pants or some type of shorts, maybe some women in some type of skirt or dress. But generally, right, we're all wearing these kind of four basic things. Nobody probably at home in a toga, nobody at home probably in a sari, right? These types of things. And it's because they're cultural, but it's also because it's a piece of conformity. Everybody else is wearing pants, why would I wear a toga? And so conformity, again, as all situations are, conformity is a very powerful social tool. The next one that we'll talk about is called social loafing. By the way, there will be a link for a great conformity video about a woman standing up and sitting down. When you see it, it's from a great show called What Would You Do? They do some great psych experiments if you've ever seen it. Okay, so social loafing is, I usually do a great demonstration in class for this, getting some folks to do some push-ups and seeing who socially loafs. But what social loafing is the tendency for when folks are doing some type of group work. It is to say when work is pooled. That just means when you turn something in, everybody's work is together, right? This is very common in group assignments, for instance, as is social loafing, you'll see. But it's just that when everything is pooled, right? When there's a group of people and they're just all doing work on one project and nobody can really tell, at least at the end of the day, nobody can really tell who did what or who contributed what. Social loafing is the tendency to pull back when you're in that situation, to do only what you need to do, or to maybe do less than what you need to do, such that other people can pick up the slack. And this is in comparison to if you were going to do that work by yourself, or if that work was going to be noted for each person. So you're going to do a group project, but you're all going to do get a separate grade, and I want you to highlight the parts of the paper that you write in different colors so I know who wrote what, right? In those cases, you're less likely to socially loaf. But if I just say, everybody turn in a group paper, everybody's gonna get the same grade, don't worry about letting me know who contributed what, right? In that case, you're likely to get some folks, if not all of the folks in that group, to say, well, I only need to write 3 of the 9 pages we need to write, and these other 2 are going to write 3 pages, so I'm only going to write 3 pages if you don't write 2.3. So again, social loafing, this is one that I think college students are kind of well appraised of because this is something that they experience all the time, whether you're the social loafer in the group or whether you tend to be the one who has to pick up the slack in the group. Next, we have Deindividuation. De-individuation, it basically means that you sort of lose your individuality. That's what the word means. But what de-individuation means is a psychological term, is that you're in a situation, and in that situation you kind of lose track of yourself. It's not that you lose your individuality totally or you lose your identity, but what it's really talking about is you lose your kind of individual sense of yourself. Well, what does this look like? Again, it's almost like a type of conformity, but really when we're talking about de-individuation, it's going to be most likely to occur, and this is part of the definition, that it's most likely to occur in situations where anonymity is high. Anonymity means that people don't know who you are, that you're anonymous. So anonymity is high, and social energy, or the energy of the event, is high, right? Or stress is high, either of those things. So anonymity is high, and then the stress of the situation, or the energy of the situation, is also high. So what happens when we're in this individualized situation? What happens when our identity or our faces, for instance, are hidden, and there's a lot of energy about what's going on? A great example to look at when we're thinking about this is maybe something like a sporting event. Well, how are people de-individualized, or how are their identities hidden, at least? Well, they're often in helmets, especially in something like football or maybe hockey. Football's probably one of the best examples because your face is almost hidden in that mask. You're in a uniform. Anybody that's live, at least watching you, that you don't really know, the big crowd is far away, right? And so there's a way in which here you can feel really de-individuated. Well, what happens when you're de-individuated? Well, you kind of lose some self-control. You kind of lose some of your super ego, if you can think of it that way. That is to say, folks will tend to do things in de-individuated situations that they wouldn't do individually. And so, this might just be like a really rough play on the football field, right? Something that you wouldn't necessarily do, or yelling at another player, or yelling at another coach or a ref, right? These type of things that are out of character for you in a day-to-day situation, but when you're in this face-hidden, energies ramped up situation, you're willing to do something that you wouldn't necessarily do. Again, you lose some of your individuality, having a little parade here. Another great situation to think about for de-individuation is some type of riot, often, or some type of protest, right? Again, here's a place where energy is really high, and often you'll see that folks at one of these really intense, at least, protests, the folks that are doing the bad stuff, right? The folks who are rioting, or the folks who are looting, often these folks will have their faces covered, right? So you put that high energy together with that anonymity of hiding your face, again, and you're more likely to do things that you wouldn't do. These situations, these interactions, these de-individuated interactions, these often happen in groups, right? You're less likely to see that at a protest one guy is rioting or one guy is looting, right? It's usually a group of people, right? So there's a piece of that conformity too, and the idea of being de-individuated means that you really need to be in a group, right? So your identity now becomes sort of, what is everybody else doing? Okay, well, nobody knows it's me, so I'm gonna go ahead and get wild too. Okay, so that's de-individuation. This is a term that when you look at the Stanford prison experiment, if you watch one video from these social psych videos, I would definitely recommend that one. That's probably one of the most talked about, certainly one of the most controversial experiments that's ever been done, and it turns out that they got it on video back in the 70s. So check that one out, and you'll see some examples. I think the psychologist talking about the experiment, Dr. Zimbardo, I think he will talk about the individuation there too a little bit. Okay, so let's look at another one here that's a little bit more positive, perhaps. And this is called social facilitation. When I do the little push-up demonstration, I also tend to be checking for what's called social facilitation. This is another one that comes to us from sports psychology, and it looks at how the group, that is to say how the crowd in particular, affects performance. So it turns out that it goes in two different directions, and this is something that I try to demonstrate on stage in class, is that in a socially facilitated situation, if I ask you to do something that you're really good at, or that's just easy, if I ask you to do that in front of a group of observers, in front of a group of people watching you, if it's easy, if you're good at it, the group is likely to increase your performance. You're likely to perform better if I ask you to do something that you know that you're good at, something that you're confident in. If I ask you to do that in front of a group, you're probably going to do it better than you would have done it just practicing by yourself or at home alone, right? You're probably going to do that better. However, if I ask you to do something that's difficult for you, or ask you to do something that you have no experience with and you don't have much confidence in, well then in those cases you're much likely to do worse. So social facilitation has this kind of fork in the road that if there's a group present, if people are watching you and this is something that you're good at, you're likely to do better. And if this is something that you're bad at and people are watching you, you're likely to feel self-conscious and get inside your head and worry about where you're messing up, and you're likely to do worse. So social facilitation, again, another one connected to sports psychology. You can see how easily you can think about a sports team's performance or an individual athlete's performance based on the crowd size, based on their own confidence in the sport or in particular aspects of the sport. Okay, let's do two more. So the next is what we call in-group bias. And this one's pretty simple. It is just our tendency to prefer people or things connected to our own group. Now that is somewhat self-defined, not necessarily consciously defined, but it is self-defined, right? If you feel connected in some way to nerds, if you feel connected in some way to women, if you feel connected, that is to say, as a part of that group, if you feel connected some way in Missourians or Midwesterners, right? All of those things are going to feel like your group, right? And when you see other people of that group, there's going to be this bias to prefer folks of that group. Now, of course, we can start to talk about, and we'll do this in the next set of lectures, we can start to talk about how this affects things like race and gender and sexual orientation. But broadly, and this isn't just about race or cultural issues, broadly, when we see somebody in our own group, on our own team, right, we're going to prefer them. We're going to prefer the things that they do. What does that mean? That means that if you're watching the Olympics and you've never watched curling, for instance, before, and you see the United States versus Canada, right, a culture very much like ours, has similar, obviously they speak the same language, they're both in America, we have, similar food, blah, 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 right? So it's not just that they're different, it's not just that they're strange to us or they're our adversary, in fact, they're our ally. But if you see a curling match, United States versus Canada, you're probably just going to root for the United States, right? Because that's your group. And so that's what the in-group bias is about, right? It's just this automatic preference to prefer people that are in our own group. Now, this can be fine, right, if you're thinking about sports or, some kind of fun, healthy competition. But obviously, as I've alluded to, you can also think about it as leading to things like racism or leading to problems with regard to, today, kind of our political system, right? Democrats way over here, Republicans way over here, and you want to just kind of stay with your own group in that way. So in-group bias is just this, again, tendency to prefer your own group. Okay, so related to in-group bias is something that we call group polarization. And in group polarization, It's our tendency that when we're in a group of like-minded people, when we're in a group that has a certain set of values or a certain set of beliefs or ideals, talking points, that when we're in that group and we only interact with that group, well, our tendency to agree with the group, our tendency to think in the ways that the group does, to believe kind of the group premise, to believe whatever they're telling us is true, well, that's going to go up. If you only hang out with folks who think the way that you think, or that think in a certain way, soon you're going to be thinking like that in a very extreme way. Again, when you think about this Ingroup bias, and the fact that we already tend to prefer our own groups, and then once we're in those groups, if we're not interacting, if we're not intermingling a bit, we're going to start to think about the other group as negative. We're going to start to think about the other group as having really bad ideas, really bad points, being bad people, whereas our group is the opposite of that. We're the good guys, we're the good people, we have good ideas, right? This just happened, right? One example I tend to give in class is, the fact that we have kind of separate news networks for Democrats and Republicans at this point, such that there's no kind of middle ground, such that you're hearing messages from the other side. If you're only hearing stuff from your own side, well then you're only going to believe that, and your beliefs in that are going to get stronger, and you're not going to be able to interact or engage or tolerate the other side as well. So I watch Fox News every once in a while just to make sure I don't go down that rabbit hole, but we can't escape it. Our biases are invisible to us, remember. All right, so group polarization, and then here just one more I'll give you, and this is what we call the mere exposure effect. This is a kind of a neat one, and again, I think that most folks can relate to if you think about it a little bit. And what it turns out that it is that mere exposure, that is to say, just being exposed to something makes us like it more. So if you take something that you've never experienced, that is, maybe it could be anything, a picture, a person, and you show them to an individual once, they might like it, but meh, they'll give you some middle grade rating. But it turns out that if I show it to you again, you're much more likely to like it more. You're much more likely to like it. So what's an example of this? Well, music is one that comes up a lot in class. Folks will say, you hear a song the first time, it's by an artist that you usually like, and they put a new album out, and you're listening to a single, and you hate it. What the hell are they doing, right? And then you listen to it a few more times, or maybe you put it away, but you just kept hearing it played on the radio. I don't know if there's an equivalent to the radio, but something where you don't have control over the music. And I don't know, by the fourth or fifth time, I don't know, this is all right. I can get into this. And by the seventh or eighth time, it's your favorite song, right? And you have faith in the artist again. So this idea of mere exposure, again, just says that once we've been exposed to something, we're very likely to like it more. I think a great thing to know about this is that it works for attractiveness. One of my mentors in college, he studied a lot about attractiveness. He was a social psychologist, and it turns out that this also works for attractiveness. So if you see somebody once, so if you're trying to get a date out there and somebody sees you once the first time and they didn't seem too hot on you, well, just keep showing up. Eventually they'll like you. I'll see you next time.